Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the first session of today's Securing Azure AD and Active Directory Summit, brought to you by Metallic, AvePoint, Zoho, and eNow. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away an Anycubic Mega X 3D printer, plus a $200 US Amazon gift certificate for supplies. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. Their sponsorship helps us bring you this summit, so we thank them for their sponsorship and support of the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit. Azure AD and Active Directory, top threats you need to know. This session features Ian Thornton-Trump, Chief Information Security Officer at Cyjax. Ian is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT and security. He has served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch, joined the CF Military Police Reserves, and retired as a public affairs officer. After a year with the RCMP as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst/consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare. Ian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, and it's always my pleasure to do these things. And I just wanted to sort of talk about, you got the typical bio thing and all that, but this has been a fascinating journey and topic for me because there's been so many great people that have helped me really start understanding where some of the challenges that we're facing from a threat perspective. I've lived in sort of that cyber threat intelligence world, and I've been really involved in talking a lot about all sorts of topics, but specifically around zero trust and Windows AD, something that I have a long history of, and I'm going to share some of those experiences with you folks today. But I will say there is one thing that I think a lot of people are asking these days, and that is, are on-premise AD servers going to be replaced by Azure AD? Now, I respond to a question with a question. And that was really on, are on-premise Exchange servers going to be replaced by Office 365? And there has been a raft of weaponized, started as 0 days, patched, and then patched again. I want to really look at this from the perspective of the jackpot ATM machine that Microsoft has set up here. And all due respect with Microsoft, this is a company that knows where the money at, okay? And to be fair, even though they're investing heavily in the next generation of the Windows Server platforms, I feel that that is being incentivized less because what they really want to do is turn every Microsoft service into a subscription base. So when we saw what happened with Microsoft Exchange in terms of all of those 0 days, which may or may not be attributed to the SolarWinds data breach that allowed Russian operatives lateral movement, some say Chinese operatives as well, lateral movement into Microsoft's environment, and they were able to download source code for Microsoft Exchange, and then subsequently we had all of these 0 days come out. I feel like Windows Active Directory on-premise is something that isn't as revenue positive for Microsoft as Active Directory Azure. So if I was to look into my future ball, I would say that we're going to go through a big period of hybrid where on-premise AD will move towards Azure AD, and then eventually Azure AD might completely replace the on-premise version of AD in the future. I look also at the costs that Microsoft has incurred. So what we're seeing here is a view of all of the 0 days that Microsoft has had to react to, and all of the vulnerabilities by type of vulnerability. And you can plainly see that it is decreasing. However, all of these cost money to fix and issue patches for. And again, your costs to fix are the developers, the bug bounty payments, the CVEs that may need to be awarded to various cybersecurity researchers, and then, of course, the testing required to see if that particular bug in Windows Server 2019 might be applicable to 2012. Or future versions of the Windows Server operating system. So Azure AD actually ends up being a cost-effective move for Microsoft in that if there is a problem with Azure AD, a bug as you were, it is able to be fixed globally because the code base is part of the Azure AD environment that Microsoft has created. And there was a conversation that I had that was quite interesting in that if a bug is found within a cloud service like Azure AD, it may not be eligible for a CVE award or acknowledgement as well. So again, there's some questions really around whether or not the support of an on-premise operating system is lucrative for Microsoft, or if from a customer perspective, having Azure AD in the cloud makes Active Directory security and the server operating system maintenance someone else's problem like Microsoft. So there's lots to consider and think about, and this actually might even be coming at the fact that the on-premise AD environment, if that server is exposed and not properly microsegmented or even segmented properly from accessing the internet, presents an attack surface for the organization. And whereas the cloud-based version of AD may not be nearly as susceptible depending on how good you are at securing it and using all of the tools available to do that. Now, this is not to say that Microsoft hasn't attempted to build products and introduce security features at an incredible rate since really 2008 when they introduced the current version of Defender, but also even previous to that in DOS and in the Windows 95 and 98 as they continually improved that product, whereas the security world of NT with Windows NT 4.0, 4.1, and Windows 2000 actually were built on the NT and a kernel, and what we saw is a coming together of that new technology, as Microsoft called it back in the day, and then the current kernels and the current sort of state of development, all with an introduction of a tremendous amount of different pieces of technology, ranging from things like Windows Hello to full disk encryption. Microsoft could be accused potentially of being very anti-competitive in the space, especially with Windows Defender APT, which is their latest offering on the security side. We'll talk a little bit about that and why it's such an important play for Microsoft. But again, all of the technologies that we talk about today, that we go to third-party vendors, have become less and less relevant because of the move to hybrid and cloud security environments. So when you are talking about the threats to Azure AD and the threats to on-premise Active Directory, you are talking about cloud-based threats, which I believe are accelerating and are becoming more concerning to businesses as they move more assets into the Azure and the Azure AD environment, whereas on-premise attacks are still a relevant attack vector. So one of the problems that we face when we discuss the threats is really around, are you on-premise, are you cloud, or are you somewhere in between the two of them? And oh, by the way, your SaaS business partners can also be attacked. So, to do a true analysis of the attack surface and the active threats against Active Directory, you really have to look at it from those two perspectives and find out what risk model is really appropriate to your organization. Now, one of the teaching tools that I use is really around this analysis report. I've included the link here. Please reach out to me either on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find at Ian Thornton-Trump or at fat_hobbit, part of the Beer Farmers, which will be having BeerCon 1 really, really soon, or BeerCon 4. Our fourth conference, so please, again, get on the internet and take a look at that. As we look at this particular compromise of a U.S. federal agency, we can see a number of things, and this is sort of the penultimate analysis, if you will, of an attack on the Windows Active Directory environment via a bunch of different vectors, including a third-party situation that I will get into and I will explain more. And I have to say that one of the biggest focuses of the analysis is really understanding MITRE ATT&CK, CK. It is important, and it is maybe the future of defending both the cloud and the on-premise with the same set of tool stacks that we're going to talk about that will help thwart these type of attacks. Now, to understand this and why the compromise of this federal government department is so important is that CISA had spent a tremendous amount of money on intrusion detection systems. Now, unfortunately, this intrusion detection system did not have an automated response capability to what it was seeing. And although this attack was detected, the attack was successful. The bad guys infiltrated the organization. They were able to exfiltrate a boatload of data, but the news came too late before CISA's resources could be brought to bear. So just to sort of frame this, because we're going to be talking about this quite a bit, is the MITRE ATT&CK, I would say, framework to understand adversarial tactics based on intrusion detections that had happened. And more in your cyber threat intelligence vendor of choice, and we at CyJax are parsing this down into the steps that an adversary is going to take in attacking your organization. And it's important because it's a great way that we can start to build tools and build threat hunting and intelligence seams that can help us detect what's going on faster, we hope, than Einstein was able to do it. So the biggest problems that we have right now when it comes to protecting on-premise Active Directory and cloud Active Directory is the signal-to-noise ratio at enterprise level when the Active Directory is not in the best shape that it can be. And this is a difficult thing for IT and IT in general, especially if you're supporting a myriad of different products and operating systems and a limited amount or an unlimited amount of different operating systems as well as different licensing. You are going to have a massive amount of events, and it is difficult to look into that haystack and go, oh, by the way, this is something that it should be raising questions within your threat hunting and intelligence teams. And we also have a problem that a lot of the tools that we need to compromise a network are actually built into the operating system itself. And that's deeply problematic from a lateral movement perspective, and we'll get into that and why that's important in a bit. The other issue that we have is, a lot of the mistaken beliefs that we have antivirus, and now we've upgraded to XDR and EDR. In a lot of those cases, those systems need to have a great amount of data, and in order to make a decision on what is going wrong on a workstation. And although they might learn that some particular activities are I would say, non-adversarial, the problem is they will overcompensate and they could shut down legitimate business operations, especially when they see non-standard binaries or uncertified binaries dropping onto workstations and making a call to an IP address that workstation has never seen before. That looks sketchy, but again, your antivirus and your XDR and your EDR have not been trained or had the opportunity to apply machine learning in order to understand what normal is or what permitted activity is. So one of the biggest problems is without some sort of standardization and other controls, you again have that massive signal-to-noise ratio where you're not actually even acting upon the information because it's so overwhelming. And then we have the boundary where we talk about sort of where the battle takes place, which is the firewall. Well, your on-premise firewall is not going to be effective in guarding your cloud. It might be effective in managing some of the connections to your cloud if you have configured your cloud to only accept particular IP addresses from your particular ASN. However, the problem comes in when you're now trying to support remote workers to applications that you've put into the cloud, thus bypassing any of the defense in depth that you've had, unless you're making people VPN into your own network in order to make a connection outwards, which, to be fair, your users will bitch and moan about performance issues, and printing can sometimes be a nightmare. So we do have a problem in that the current architectures that we have don't support identification of adversarial activity particularly well. And what we're reserved to is logging, but we have an intrinsic problem of logging in that we may be logging far too much, which brings up the signal-to-noise ratio problem and overwhelms machine learning and AI capabilities, or we're not logging enough, which won't give us any indications that any of the tripwires have been set off indicating that we have a particular compromise. And the bad guys know this. So interestingly enough, the first problem that we had with this a malicious threat actor that attacked the government agencies is they got in and they got domain administrator access from an Office 365 email, okay? So valid access credentials for multiple users, O365 accounts, including domain administrator accounts. Now, here's the interesting thing. They got the access credentials, right, and probably, if not certainly, for the Office 365 accounts, they could have had multi-factor authentication. But here's what's really interesting about this threat actor. Now having access credentials for the email accounts, they pivoted and looked for an unpatched VPN server by exploiting a known vulnerability, okay? So what happened here was that the credentials may have been compromised and MFA might have even been activated on those accounts, but they pivoted to a VPN server and tried to exploit on that VPN server. Now, this is one of the nastiest exploits you could possibly have on a VPN server because the attack would essentially make the VPN server vomit up the credentials that it had. So the bad guys could now confirm that they had an administrator account with the same credentials that would give access to the VPN server, and thus they were able to walk into the organization. So a couple of things that are really interesting here is right away we can tell about two things. The first is there wasn't third-party monitoring on potential credentials for multiple users in the Office 365 cloud that the bad guys had. And so, again, if you had that third-party monitoring, like have I been pwned, it's possible that if those credentials were in a public data breach somewhere, the organization would have had time to rotate those credentials, making it at least more difficult for the bad guys. But unfortunately, once the bad guys had those credentials, the fact that the VPN server had this massive exploit told me a little bit about the fact that they weren't listening to the threat intelligence, they weren't patching their VPN server, so the bad guys were able to walk in. All they needed to do was take that list of access credentials and compare it to the list that they could pull off the VPN server. So really, really important. And again, there's pros and cons to having domain administrator accounts with email. Sometimes that's really important for notifications and stuff like that. However, domain access privileges need to be far more restrictive in this day and age of threat actors. And that is where our number one threat to AD is right now, is your domain administrator accounts. You really have to lock them down and really restrict them. Otherwise, it's really the ball game in one or two steps for the bad guys to get access to your entire infrastructure and network. Now, here's another really interesting and sketchy thing that a firewall or even good XDR or EDR might notice, that the bad guys, the threat actors, connected multiple times from this IP address, which is a virtual private server IP address located in Sweden. Now, it's interesting to me that a U.S. federal government department would have a allow all, essentially, from the Swedish IP addresses. Now, we don't know if maybe this was a common activity where IP addresses were connecting to this government department from Sweden. We don't have that information. But again, it's sort of one of those things that should have raised, in my opinion, red flags on whatever scene you had when you start to see multiple connections from an IP address that has never been connected to before. And then when you have a bit of threat intelligence, doesn't have to be a lot behind it, you find that it's in a hosting provider in Sweden. And again, I have to underline that that connection that was being made obviously indicated the bad guys trying to successfully exploit the VPN server for that known vulnerability, that CVE 2019-11510, because any of us that have played with Metasploit or other tools and downloaded proof of concepts that folks have posted on the internet knows that sometimes they're not the most reliable things on the planet, right? So again, you're going to see activity that doesn't make a lot of sense, and that's another red flag that would have been picked up in the SIM or possibly EDR on the desktop, right, as the bad guys tried to get in. Now, here's other noise which should be triggering for EDR, XDR, SIMs, or even sort of in the intelligence that you would have with analysis of threat actor under MITRE attacks. So as soon as they got in, the first things that usually happen are Active Directory enumeration and group policy and registry changes immediately, possibly in group policy to facilitate things like turning off the AV or uninstalling security or clearing logs. Any sort of thing can happen once you've got domain activity going on, once you have domain credentials, and you're now hitting that Active Directory to find more users with elevated privileges. You're making the network more susceptible to different types of attack. what was not implied in this is that what might quite be an attack on Kerberos and other authentication modules for further lateral movement within the organization. They don't come out and say that in the report, but, I'm trying to put my threat actor helmet on here, and, it looks a lot like a Darth Vader helmet, I will add, and sort of extrapolate what the very careful language that they were using here. And then we see the threat actor on the Windows command line, going to go after remote desktop environments, because we know that, for one good Mimkatz enumeration, we can get a whole host of user IDs and passwords, including folks that may not actually have VPN access. So I'm now able to use those user IDs to further move throughout the network. And we're seeing the type of commands that particular threat actor used to enumerate the compromised system and the entire network. So again, we're seeing these type of things where a lot of stuff going on with some decent XDR, EDR, or SIM capability could have picked up really quickly, especially because a lot of this would be logged if your audit policies are set. And we'll talk about why that's so important is too. Now, this is the one that kind of like blows my mind, okay? You have, every time you have a connection being made, and this connection was an outbound connection from the remote desktop terminal that got compromised, okay? So you have an executable being run in that remote desktop environment. You have a reverse tunnel, a reverse SOX proxy connection made over SSH outbound from the remote desktop terminal, which, to be fair, should have been something maybe blocked at the firewall, right? And then you have a locally mounted remote share on an IP address going across the entire internet outbound, right? And you also, again, because you've now mounted the share, and they don't exactly tell you how that share was mounted, although I suspect it was probably something like NetBIOS or a protocol that wasn't restricted outbound from the firewall. And to make things even more difficult, this was an SSH connection with probably NetBIOS inside that connection, or SMB, which is port 445, tunneled through this secure shell. So again, when your next generation firewalls look at this, they say, okay, I've seen SSH outbound, but that protocol may have another encrypted protocol with inside it. And again, some firewalls will be doing deep packet inspection and go, this doesn't make sense. This does not look like a NetBIOS or a SMB connection. It looks wrong. So depending on the amount of visibility that you have within your network boundary, sometimes you can get an indication of a protocol, standard protocol running on a non-standard port, which should tip you off that something really strange is going on. And again, you're seeing 5140, a network share object was accessed, in this case remotely, which is a pretty rare thing. So then we have the threat actor logging into internal email account and internal servers via remote desktop protocol inside the organization. And we see that 445, 137, 138, and 139 are all protocols that were available for that threat actor to use. So in this particular case, we're not even making it difficult. We're actually contributing to our signal-to-noise ratio tremendously, because we're giving the threat actor a full suite of different protocols and different ways that they can connect to things. And I do raise this question on, was there any attempts to Windows Firewall configurate in terms of like how you should be connecting securely to servers. Was there a corporate firewall available and blocking these type of outbound connections? So there's a whole bunch of things that happened here that really raised question. And this is now talking about preventing the second threat to Azure AD and Active Directory, which is lateral movement once those accounts are compromised. So having the ability to connect to all the boxes with all these different protocols makes it really easy for your adversary to hide, okay? And again, it really raises the question that if by default all of these different protocols are available, how is the Windows operating system a security solution, right? Now in Windows Server 2016 and the later build and then Windows Server 2019, you literally have to install SMB v1 for file sharing, as opposed to just having it turned on, which was the case in 2008 and next previous versions, including Server 2012. So Microsoft is learning that this is a very bad thing. And then, interestingly enough, in new builds of Windows 10, starting from build 1709, support for SMB1 protocol is disabled as well. And there's some intelligence to this as well, because the operating system will self-configure. I think this is in Windows Server 2019 that this feature is. If it doesn't see anything using the SMB v1 protocol, it will disable it, and I think it's 30 or 90 days. So Windows is making an effort to take something that was notorious, i.e. responsible for WannaCry and NotPetya attacks, because people were able to remotely connect using SMB1, which also, under certain circumstances, could vomit up the domain user credentials if they were used to mount a share within the organization, and you were able to packet capture, you could get the passwords off the wire. So this is a huge security issue that, again, Microsoft was not particularly quick to deal with, and thus in many networks to this day, especially with vulnerability scanning, you'll start seeing red coming back on your reports if it finds SMB v1. Here's one of the big problems. A lot of IoT devices, especially network-attached storages, devices are still supporting SMB v1 protocols. So again, unless you're taking additional steps to isolate these devices and lock them down, you could inadvertently be really exposing yourself to attacks that can enumerate SMB v1 and also use it as an exfiltration protocol. So it's good. So the next one, again, is just kind of a head shaker. They created local accounts on workstations. Now, in an enterprise environment, I'm just going to say that if you're seeing 4720 on anything other than a domain controller, something has gone tragically wrong within your organization, because local accounts should not be created without a big change ticket and a why are we doing this. So these two events are like this smoking gun for lateral movement followed by persistence attempts on the workstations. Because what the bad guys are going to do is they're going to create accounts that they can use, that they know the passwords to, in order to make sure that they can maintain persistence. And they're going to try and do that on the workstations because they're hoping that those workstations haven't been configured to send these type of events to some sort of SIM that will blow their evil plan for getting into your workstation, compromising it, creating a user potentially with elevated privileges or local domain privileges so that they can start installing services and things like that. So again, this is one of those examples where you can cut the bad guys off at the pass of forwarding these kind of events and making sure your SIM, if you're buying a new SIM or you're testing a new SIM, that you try these type of things, and if you're not getting alerts off of it, man, it's going to be fairly easy for your bad guys, your red teamers, or your pen testers to take apart your network and make your life really difficult. Now, this is the one. These are the ones that really are and were used in this particular case. Now, there are different ways of maintaining persistence on a workstation. By far the easiest is a Windows script with schedule task to basically re-download and reinfect the malware from file storage. And it could be a Discord server. It could be anywhere that you can essentially store a file to bring that down, to unzip it, unpack it, start a service or process to decrypt it. But at the end of the day, when we do a lot of investigation into threat actor activity, the scheduled task being created, deleted, enabled, disabled, updated, what have you, on an individual workstation is a sure sign that the bad guys are in there and they're doing something that's unauthorized. Now, the scheduled task is interesting, too, because if the workstation is an older operating system and it's not patched, it includes the ability to privilege escalate without necessarily requiring credentials, because scheduled tasks can be run at the system level in the organization. Now, to create a scheduled task requires elevated privileges in general. We don't just let users do that. But because we talked about the ability to obtain a local administrator password by using something like Mimkatz, then now we have the ability to create the scheduled task on the workstation. So 4698, 99, 4700, 4701, 4702, again, are smoking guns. Now, I need to lay this out for you because just one of these happening in an organization shouldn't necessarily dispatch, the cars with lights and sirens and, cause that workstation to lock down or those servers to being put offline. But the combination of these things, as depicted in the MITRE attack table, become the likely probability that something weird is going on. Okay? So the bad guys may be doing this over a period of days or hours once the initial compromise has taken place. And you need the retention and the machine learning and the AI, if you want to call it that for marketing speak, in order to chart this path of seeing the new account created on a workstation and then followed by the use of elevated privileges to create a scheduled task on a workstation, and some other interesting things like the SSH tunnel or those kind of things. Those are really, really big things that immediately tell you that something non-standard is going on, and that workstation is now operating outside the parameters of your baseline, and it needs to be investigated. And this goes back to my initial discussion about signal-to-noise ratio. If you have so many different things going on within the network, you need multiple needles before you understand that the bad guys have a foothold in your haystack. And then again, there's a bunch of links that I put in about MITRE attack and different ways of looking at the challenges and auditing of command line changes and PowerShell challenges with script blocking. Because again, where we're dealing with this is a lot of this stuff is living off the land. This is folks using PowerShell to do things and make changes and create users. So invoke PowerShell on a non-IT related workstation in a user context is going to be deeply problematic, and it's something that you're going to look at because this goes back to the living on the land type of thing and should be a relatively rare event where a user is attempting to launch PowerShell on a workstation to do something, especially if it's a script of some sort. So again, there are ways to set up these tripwires, and the living on the land piece is probably one of the more common ones that we see when a network is infiltrated by bad guys and they want to start doing their reconnaissance and going for persistence. Now, this is probably the number one thing I will say that is where the alarm bells start ringing in an organization is a new service being installed on a system, okay? That 4697 log event is one that in the standard workstation configuration and in a world where we're using our web browsers for nearly everything that we do, there's no compelling reason that this should, A, happen, if you are running users in the user context because users are not allowed to install systems or install new services, number one. And number two, there should be an error if they try. If a new service is logged on a system, by default, that user has been privilege escalated, and it's something that you need to look at. It might be routine. They might be authorized to do that, but it does need to be investigated. And it's also a key change control event, right? And because this service can be anything, right? And that's really important to investigate. And again, that workstation has now fallen out of baseline parameters, and it is now going to be unique in the organization, possibly prevent a possibly indicative of some sort of compromise. And again, this is Microsoft responding, not as quickly as we can to this particular threat, because we're talking about a minimum OS version of Windows Server 2016 or Windows 10 for this event to be actually logged in the system. So again, if you're looking at trying to thwart bad guys, 4697 on domain controllers, remote desktop servers, or workstations that are running as a standard user are going to be really, really important things to take a look at. So another couple of things to do, and this is sort of going into the threats to Active Directory and how to really lower the attack surface, is that you may have GPOs where you're going to legit turn off services in order to prevent compromises of those services. I've put down some of the earliest dates of compromise, but we can see 2010 compromise, spooler service, goes back to Stuxnet. Shout out to my friends from Zen Internet who are with me today, because we always love to talk about Stuxnet. The server service first compromised in 2008, workstation service in 2006, and fonts in 2015. If you could shut down those services, especially when you work in a world of kiosks or you go to a third party like the Citrix environment, controversial to shut down the spooler service. I get it, but do workstations really all have to be little file servers? Are there workstations in your organization that don't connect to servers? They are standalone boxes. Like a great example is business management systems or BMS systems that don't necessarily need to connect to servers. There are a lot of ways that you can harden your environments. I mentioned fonts. Giving users the ability to install fonts, again, can be incredibly dangerous, because font buffer overflows have been an attack surface that we've known for a long time. And then there's obviously the superfluous stuff that Windows includes, especially the latest version of Windows, where, oh my God, the amount of services alone that your box is running, thinking about this just sort of granularly and going, do we really need remote registry capability? How do we do our remote desktop functions within the organization? What do we use to do that? All of this information can be onboarded to make your organization much harder. And even Microsoft is recognizing this now with bringing together Intune, Azure AD, Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. This is a big, big trend because of the adversaries that have been attacking us. We really need to pay attention to Microsoft's vision of the future, which is really around unifying both IT management and the actual software that they have to provide defense in depth. And again, I call it the great convergence, where Microsoft is really going to leverage this, and I'm fairly confident to take a short position on overpriced, under-delivering EDR vendors, because Microsoft is coming for them at a price that can't be beat, and in some cases is rolled into whatever software you're already buying from them. So some truly, truly interesting developments where IT is becoming IT security, and the expectations are always to do configuration and management in a secure context, for sure. Now, I did include more of you for just like a few things, a few tips that can really wreck a adversarial bad guys days. These are group policy objects. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all of them. Some of them, for those that have managed Windows directories from the dawn of time, know very well and have probably enabled these types of policies as we've gone along in time. You know, the LAN manager hash being a favorite target of Jack the Ripper, believe it or not, folks, in some organizations to support some older client-server applications. We are still dealing with this stuff for this very day. Obviously, controlling access to the command prompt in PowerShell are no-brainers. That's really important and can already thwart the bad guys if they can't invoke PowerShell somehow. We've seen it time and time again from the early days that removable media really has to be in the hands of trusted individuals, mostly because of the potential for insider threat. And we see tons of espionage cases that have been about somebody copying data and taking it home and or then making it publicly available, like a Snowden and one of the latest folks convicted about the Vault 7 disclosures as well. And then, of course, restricting the software installations. This is interesting because this one can be used where you've given your users local administrative access to the computer. However, the GPO of the domain that you've configured for the workstation will override that ability for them to install if the machine is a domain-joined machine. So, again, you can live with those privileges, which I don't recommend, but there are some folks that, you know, YOLO it when it comes to Windows admin. But, again, the GPOs at the domain level will override the local domain policy in most cases. And, you know, minimum password lengths, we've all worried about that in terms of the brute forcing. And just to reiterate, you know, in older networks, you may have to actually set the audit directory security, Active Directory security policies. These by default are generally recorded here in your Azure AD environment. But again, unless you set up specific logging via Sentinel, which is Microsoft's kind of SIEM that, well, logging utility that can then be configured like a SIEM, as well as pushing stuff into Elastic Stacks or other type of things in order to, you know, do your own Splunk dashboards. All of this data, though, really does need to be paired up with the network telemetry that you're seeing at your managed devices and or at the perimeter of your organization in order to paint an exact picture of any sort of attempts at lateral movement that might fit the MITRE attack table. And then again, you know, final thoughts on thwarting the bad guys and the threats that are out there. It has to be a multi-factor authentication, SSO, and role-based access controls for account protection as much as you can layer on without, you know, increasing the burden on employees. Really harden those Office 365 email with all of the potential security that can be mustered, including some geofencing, which is included in Office 365's advanced configuration. DMARCs, SPF, DKIM, all of that is good stuff that really can be enabled in order to protect not just your organization, but other organizations being contacted allegedly on your behalf. Very, very important. I say protect those exposed services as step one in preventing attacks within your organization that will get access to your Azure AD, such as CDNs and web application firewalls. SIEM and EDR, XDR are sort of now, I would call them standard within medium to enterprise level. Really, really important to track those things that start to look like MITRE attack table. Great SIEM vendors are doing some really interesting things with machine learning and AI and learning from APT actors and how they go about compromising the networks. Phishing email protection, I mean, it does kind of work, but I wouldn't rely on it. I would have it as part of my layered protection approach, but there's not really a week that goes by that something doesn't make it into my inbox, which I love to tweet out. AD and DR for secure replication. Back up your AD, folks. The big win for the victim of NotPetya, the firm Maersk, was they managed to shut down an Active Directory server before it got hit by the ransomware. And from that one server that was in Africa that it didn't get infected because of a saturated link, it became one of the most important thing for them to restore their Active Directory configuration at a global level, which is an amazing story, and you can catch it online. And again, intelligence-led vulnerability management. Try and anticipate what the bad guys are going to attack you with by getting some good intel feeds, by listening to what CSA is telling you to pay attention to, because at the end of the day, the best cyber attack is one that's trying to exploit a vulnerability that you've already patched. And now, bring it on, folks. I hope you enjoyed this. Let's rock a Q&A.
Okay, great job, Ian. We do have some questions, and I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And let's get right to it. We'll take them first come, first serve. Actually, we have a couple of questions about zero trust, and this is one of them.
Yeah.
Han Yin from the audience asked early on in your presentation, how do you properly design your zero trust around AAD, and why AAD and not AD parentheses on-prem?
Yeah. So here's the deal. So first of all, you have to kind of trust Microsoft, but there's 3 pillars to zero trust, right? So the first one is visibility, okay? And from visibility, all the other 2, and I'll talk about them in a second. But gain visibility, get a SIEM, make sure you can discover anomalous behavior. So this will require training that SIEM, working on your signal-to-noise ratio. Let's try, 100% in IT doesn't exist, but when you're talking about managing your infrastructure and you're going to talk about your workstation and endpoint identities, you have to get that visibility. The next part of it is automation, okay? So if you're getting data that indicates that you have some sort of anomalous behavior, you want a tool that is going to automate the ability to act, right, and deal with that particular situation. So if that's an anomalous detection has been detected using some piece of software, then we're going to flag that, we're going to create a ticket, we're going to isolate that machine, and we're going to fire up our incident response, right? The next place is orchestration. So that is now grabbing the data from that workstation, trying to understand what happened, and then maybe perhaps paving that workstation over and firing it back to its configuration that it had before. Because what you're going to need to do when it comes to zero trust is understand anomalous behavior, figure out an automated response to that to take humans that can make mistakes out of the equation, and then orchestrate your response to it. So it can be done, but you're going to have a level of trust in terms of what you're going to trust from Microsoft. And to be fair, the tools to kind of do that are all really being built into the Microsoft Active Directory in the cloud in Azure, because Sentinel and Defender and Endpoint Configuration Manager can all be automated and get that level of orchestration. So the best person to talk to is the senior IT architect that you have, Active Directory folks, and even have them interface with Microsoft and say, we're trying to adopt a zero trust framework. How are we going to implement the level of visibility we need, the level of automation we need, and then the level of orchestration that we need? And they'll point you in the right direction. Or you can talk to one of our vendor partners or some of the other vendors out there and talk about what your needs are going to be when it comes to endpoint and identity, which are the 2 sort of areas that really encompass the role of Active Directory within your organization.
Okay, great. Let's squeeze in one more quick question. This comes from Raj in the audience. He says, Azure Active Directory Domain Services is not Azure AD. Will on-premises be replaced by that? This was early on in the presentation when you were talking about on-premises offerings being replaced by cloud.
Yeah, so I think the future is really going to be cloud for identity and access management. There will be use cases where you're going to have on-premise AD, but I think slowly Microsoft is weaning you off that for two reasons. One, it doesn't make them as much money, and two, it does increase the attack surface. But again, this is from the perspective of large enterprise organizations that are supporting, 200, 300 plus applications. I don't think Microsoft's going to turn around and say, yank all of your Active Directory on-premise servers. I think that would be mental. But I see this more and more in the medium and larger businesses, like I'm talking maybe one and a couple of branch offices, that it's far easier to do Active Directory, either hybrid, where you have the Active Directory services in the cloud and also on-premise for redundancy and resiliency. Eventually, I think what we're going to see is all of the AD functions, no matter what it is, from GPOs to security policies to tools, deployed via the cloud. I see that coming hard and fast.
Okay. Well, looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Ian, for a great presentation and answering those questions.
You're welcome.
Everyone else?
Always my pleasure to be part of the fun.
Okay, great. Everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Best Practices for Securing Active Directory and Azure AD. So take a break. This would be a good time to check out those resources on your console provided by Metallic, AvePoint, Zoho, and eNow, and we'll be right back.
Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course, our great sponsors, Metallic, AvePoint, Zoho, and eNow, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am here to moderate the second session of our Securing Azure AD and Active Directory Summit, called Best Practices for Securing Active Directory and Azure AD. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, Microsoft's MVP and technology writer. Brian Posey is a freelance technology author and a 21-time Microsoft MVP. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and has created numerous full-length video training courses. He's also published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of these blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column, both available on redmondmag.com. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much, Chris. And hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. I missed the first presentation, but I caught the last 5 minutes of it or so of it, and it sounds like it was really great. So hope everyone enjoyed that. At any rate, the subject of Active Directory security and Azure AD security best practices is something that I have been asked to speak on quite a few times here lately. So for this particular presentation, I wanted to do something just a little bit different rather than rehash the same best practices that have been covered over and over. What I wanted to do for this one is take an entirely different approach. And rather than just go through a checklist of best practices, which you could easily look up on your own, I wanted to talk about where priorities should be. In other words, what are the things that I would consider to be the most important things to be doing right now with regard to your Active Directory and Azure AD security. And I came up with 6 that are on the list in this presentation. And these aren't in any sort of order or anything like that, but they are all 6 things that you should definitely take a look at. And actually, there's a 7th thing. For whatever reason, I don't know, maybe I was just having a day, but the 7th item didn't make it into the slides. But I would say that it's important nonetheless, and maybe even one of the most important items on the list. And that item would be to begin by performing a full audit of your Active Directory environment. More specifically, audit group memberships and permissions that are assigned to groups. Now, why is that? Well, If an attacker is going to compromise your Active Directory environment, group memberships are a great place to start, because once an attacker manages to get in, one of the first things that they're typically going to try to do is to establish a foothold, so that even if they're found out, they've got some way of getting back in. So an attacker may create a secondary account that's got a structure that's designed to blend in with your legitimate accounts. They may go in and add their own account or other accounts that they create to Active Directory groups. And this doesn't even necessarily have to be something that's happening right now. This could be something that an attacker did way back when. And, it was kind of funny. When I was putting this presentation together, I ran across an article. I believe it was on a Microsoft TechNet blog. I'm not 100% certain about that, but I think that's where I saw that. And the author of this particular article actually made the statement that if you've got a legacy Active Directory environment in place on premises that's been there for quite some time, you should just automatically assume that that environment is compromised. And I've got to tell you, when I read that, it elicited a fairly strong reaction. I never like to trash another author's work or anything, and it's certainly not my intention here, so please don't misunderstand me. But when I read that statement, I was like, no, there is absolutely no way that that can be true. I refuse to accept the idea that just because my Active Directory environment has been in place for a long time, that it's automatically compromised and therefore bad. Now, having said that, the more that I thought about that statement, the more I began to realize that maybe there is a little bit of truth in it. Certainly, I don't regard that statement as being absolute in any sort of capacity. I don't buy the idea that just because an environment has been in place for a while, it's automatically compromised. But think about, especially in the older days of Active Directory, for anybody who's been in IT that long, all of the things that were at one time commonplace that are today considered to be direct violations of security best practices, things that we all did, not to mention things that were, I don't know, what's a good word for it, frowned upon, but people did it anyway. I mean, let me give you an example. How many times have you seen, particularly in smaller organizations and, in the distant past, somebody sign on directly to a domain controller console, open up a web browser, and download a tool from some sketchy website? It's one of those things that nobody likes to admit to, but yet I've seen it happen in real-world environments, and I'm sure most of you probably have too. So, if somebody did something like that, even if it was in the distant past, that opened the door for that environment to become compromised. And just because it's not being actively attacked today doesn't mean that an attacker hasn't established a foothold at some point in the distant past and could use that to regain access at any time that they want. So just something to think about. And the whole idea of somebody sitting down at a domain controller and opening up a web browser, that's just one example. There have been so many examples I can think of really egregious Active Directory health practices. I'll throw out one more before I move on. Back before the world shut down, I was at a tech conference, probably somewhere around 2017, 2018, and I don't remember which conference this was, but the company that was putting on the conference had set up a bunch of kiosk PCs in the hallways so people could log on, check their email, and that sort of thing. I actually saw somebody using one of these public machines to go in and perform some sort of maintenance on their Active Directory environment. I mean, you cannot make this stuff up. I mean, yes, the machines are presumably clean. They reset to a pristine state at the end of each session. But still, just the idea of using a public machine to do something like that. And I guess all of that is to say that, if you do have people that are doing these really egregious things in their Active Directory environments, even if that was something that was done way back in the past that's no longer done today, there's at least the potential that maybe that environment has been compromised at some point along the way. So that's why I'm saying that the single most important thing that you can do to ensure the security and integrity of your Active Directory environment is to start out by performing a really detailed audit of all of your permissions and all of your group memberships. And even if nothing was compromised, you're probably going to be able to make the environment a lot more secure just by doing that type of audit. Because think about your own environment. How many groups do you have that nobody's quite sure what that group even does anymore? Maybe it was set up years and years ago for some special purpose. It served its purpose. Everybody moved on. The group was never deleted. And yet here you have this abandoned group that has permissions associated with it, and nobody even knows what it's for anymore. So things like that can really undermine your security in certain situations. So those are the types of things that I recommend taking a really hard look at. Now, obviously, that's going to be easier said than done, especially in certain larger environments. Sometimes corporate bureaucracy gets in the way. Sometimes the Active Directory structure is just so massive that it would be nearly impossible to go through every group one at a time. But anything that you can do to just get a handle on all of your groups, make sure that the groups are still serving their purpose, make sure that the membership is appropriate, that you don't have people with memberships to things that they shouldn't have access to. Anything that you can do along those lines will only improve your overall security. So that's really where I would start out at with regard to best practices for securing your Active Directory. So with that said, let's go ahead and switch gears a little bit, and let's talk about the 6 items that I came up with that are included in the slide deck. Now, as I said a moment ago, these aren't in any sort of order, but they are things that I consider to be important, and maybe they're not all practical for every single organization, but they are things that are worth at least taking a look at. So let's go ahead and get started. So priority 1, and again, these aren't in any kind of order, upgrade Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect, for anyone who's not familiar with it, I'm assuming most of the people on this call are, but just in case you're not, it's a utility provided by Microsoft. It runs on a dedicated physical or virtual machine, and it synchronizes your on-premises Active Directory environment up to Azure AD, whether that's a standalone Azure Active Directory environment or an Azure Active Directory environment used by Microsoft 365. The idea is that it synchronizes all of your on-premises accounts with the cloud accounts. So Azure AD Connect has been around for quite some time, and quite a ways back, Microsoft released a new version of it, version 2.0, but there are still quite a few organizations that are still running the older version. So one of the very first things that I would look at with regard to enhancing Active Directory security is to go ahead and upgrade Azure AD Connect if you haven't already, and just make sure that you're on the latest version of that. Now, why the urgency? Why do this now? Well, there are a few different reasons. One of the big reasons is because Microsoft is getting ready to retire version 1 of Azure AD Connect. The retirement date is currently scheduled for August 31st of this year, so it's coming up in just about a month. So this is definitely something that you'll want to pay attention to if you haven't already upgraded. So what do you get by upgrading? Well, the new version is really just kind of like the old version. You're not going to gain any new features or any new capabilities or anything like that. But having said that, there are quite a few changes that have taken place under the hood that are designed to make Azure AD Connect a lot more secure. And having Azure AD Connect a lot more secure is really important because Microsoft recommends that from a security standpoint, you treat your Azure AD Connect server just like a domain controller. So you exercise the same level of security with Azure AD Connect that you would with an Active Directory domain controller. They consider it to be that sensitive of a resource. So what are these new security capabilities? Well, Microsoft has used it to use the C++ redistributable version 14. They're using TLS 1.2. Binaries are now signed with the SHA-2 algorithm. PowerShell 5 is a requirement. And Windows Server 2016 or higher is required. So you're gaining a little bit of extra security just by the fact that it requires a newer version of Windows Server. And in case anybody's wondering, the reason why that newer version of Windows Server is required is because of the way that SQL Server 2019 components are used. And one more change from a security perspective is that the Active Directory Authentication Library, which is often abbreviated ADAL, is no longer used, and Microsoft has opted instead to use a much newer library called the Microsoft Authentication Library, or MSAL. So why the urgency? I mentioned that the older version of Azure AD Connect is being retired in about a month, but historically, when Microsoft retires a product, that doesn't mean that it's no longer going to work. It just means that they're no longer providing security updates. Well, Azure AD Connect might be the exception to the rule, because if you take a look at this slide, you can see a couple of quotes that came directly from the Microsoft website. And both of these would indicate that there's a good chance that the older version of Azure AD Connect may just suddenly and unexpectedly stop working at any time after the retirement occurs. I mean, the first quote on this list is, "We expect TLS 1.0/1.1 to be deprecated in 2022, and we need your help to make sure you aren't using these protocols by that date." Unfortunately, they don't give you the exact date, "as your service may stop working unexpectedly." And then it goes on to say that you can manually configure your server for TLS 1.2, and that you can do that without actually having to upgrade if you've got some reason why you need to stick to using the older version of Azure AD Connect. But then the second quote goes on to say that after December 2022, ADAL, that's the Active Directory Authentication Library, is planned to go out of support. And when that happens, authentication may stop working unexpectedly. And this will block the Azure AD Connect server from working properly. So they go on to say that they strongly advise you to upgrade to Azure AD Connect version 2 before December of 2022. And I've provided a link down at the bottom of the slide with a source to this document, just in case anybody wants to check that out. So the next thing, sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. One other thing that I want to talk about briefly with regard to Azure AD Connect is its dependency on SQL Server. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can install Azure AD Connect. You can install it what I like to call self-contained, in which case it uses a locally installed copy of SQL Server Express, or you can install it to use an external SQL Server, which is what larger deployments will typically do. So this raises the question of, okay, if you've got an external SQL Server and that external SQL Server is already running SQL Server 2019 or higher, do you still have to upgrade? And the answer to that is yes, because of all of the dependencies on TLS and things like that. So Microsoft does recommend that you go ahead and upgrade Azure AD Connect even if your SQL servers have already been upgraded. Now, if you're using SQL Server Express, so you're doing a self-contained deployment where all the components reside within the Azure AD Connect server, then the recommendation there is to go ahead and do the in-place upgrade, but when you're done, make sure that you uninstall the old SQL Server components because those don't get removed automatically, and you don't want those legacy components lingering around on a server that needs to be secured. Okay, so priority number 2, deploy Azure AD Connect Health. Azure AD Connect Health is a utility. It's separate from Azure AD Connect, and you will need an Azure AD Premium P1 subscription in order to do this. But what this utility does is it goes out and it monitors Azure AD Connect related synchronizations just to make sure that everything's healthy. Now, I'll be the first to admit that connection health really doesn't have a lot to do with security, at least not directly, but it's still important to keep an eye on because think about something like object synchronization. If all of a sudden you've unexpectedly got a whole bunch of Active Directory objects that are being synchronized, and you're not out there doing Active Directory maintenance that would trigger those synchronizations, well, that probably indicates that you've got some sort of security problem. So having a health monitor in place can actually enhance your security efforts. So Azure AD Connect Health might not be a utility that is well suited for every organization, but it's still something that's at least worth taking a look at and making a judgment as to whether or not it's right for your own organization. So let's take a look at what this looks like. The main purpose of this tool is to spot synchronization errors. And when an error occurs, it categorizes that error as a way of helping you to figure out what's going on. And there are several different categories of errors that it can spot. For example, it can spot a duplicate attribute error. So that's the sort of error that would occur if, for example, you were to try to create a user and a user with that user principal name already exists. It can also detect errors related to a data mismatch. And those are errors that are attributed to soft match fails on objects that are already being synchronized. Then there are data validation failures. For example, if you've got a malformed user principal name, or if, for example, you insert an invalid character in an object that you've created, something like that, that would fall into the category of a data validation failure. It can also spot errors related to federated domain changes. So if you've got a user who is being federated by a different domain that falls outside the management scope, that would trigger one of these errors. There are large attribute errors. So if an attribute is larger than what can be synchronized, then you've got an error type for that. And then there's just this other category called other. This is every kind of error that doesn't fit into one of these specific categories that I've briefly mentioned already. And there's a link at the bottom of the slide that you can go to find all of this information for yourself. So what does this tool really look like? Well, I've got a couple of screen captures here, and these were taken directly off of a Microsoft website. This isn't from my own environment or anything. So if you look in the upper left corner, you can see that we have 9 sync errors. So we have the domain name listed, and then we have a number 9 indicating that there are 9 sync errors. And then down below, we have sync errors by type. Now, don't ask me why there are 21 sync errors listed by type, but only 9 sync errors listed in the summary screen at the top. I have no idea. I just took the screen capture off a Microsoft website. But I went ahead and included the screen capture, even though it doesn't make a lot of sense, just because I wanted to show you the types of information that you can get from this tool. So you can see that we have, in this case, 15 duplicate attribute errors, 0 data mismatch errors, 3 data validation failures, 1 large attribute error, 2 federated domain problems, and 0 other problems. So you get a really nice breakdown of the types of errors that are happening. Then there's this screen, and the main thing that I wanted to show you on this screen is if you look in the upper left corner, you can see that we have Azure Active Directory Connect servers, and we've got a listing for this particular server, and you can tell at a glance that that server is in an unhealthy state. And the reason why this is so important is because Azure AD Connect is one of those tools that we sometimes tend to take a set it and forget it mentality with regard to. So in other words, we deploy Azure AD Connect, we make sure everything's working, we spot check it a couple of times over the coming weeks just to make sure it's still working properly. And then, especially in smaller shops, there's a tendency to just kind of forget all about it and let it do its thing. And, you know, the big problem with that, of course, is that problems may end up going unnoticed. Well, as you can see, this particular tool will actually flag problems that it may otherwise have taken a while for an organization to notice. And then if a problem does occur, the really nice thing is that you can drill down into the alerts that are generated. So in this case, there was one alert that was tied to the error that I showed you on the previous screen, and then if you click on it, it shows you that that alert is tied to an error. And this is a little bit tough to read, but it says Azure AD Connect sync server is not, and then it's cut off. I can't read the rest of it. But then it gives you the state. We can see that it's an active alert. It shows when the alert was raised, when it was most recently detected. And then it actually goes on and tells you what you can do to fix the problem. So this is a really helpful tool in resolving any issues that may occur in your Azure AD Connect environment. So it's certainly something that I would encourage you to take a look at. And then you can even look at things like your run profile latency over the last several days. So you can see how long it's taking objects to be replicated up to Azure AD. And then you can also get statistics about changes that are being made to your Active Directory objects. And this screen right here goes back to what I was talking about several minutes ago, where you may potentially have a number of objects that are suddenly being synchronized when you didn't make any known changes to those objects, and that could potentially indicate a security problem. So this is the screen right here where you would go to detect those sorts of problems. You'll notice the big green spike in the middle, showing that there were nearly 10,000 objects that are being synchronized all of a sudden. Now, if you're doing Active Directory maintenance, then that might be to be expected, and this could be totally normal. But if you're not doing anything that should trigger thousands and thousands of synchronizations, that might be something that you would want to take a look at. So, priority 3, enable multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is one of those things that's been discussed over and over and over again by me and by other people. So I'm not going to go into this one in any sort of depth at all other than to mention how important it is. What I would say is that it might not necessarily be practical for you to enable multi-factor authentication across the board for your entire organization, but you should absolutely enable it wherever you can. Because according to Microsoft, multi-factor authentication can stop up to 99% of attacks against user accounts. Now, I've seen similar studies on other websites where the numbers are a little bit different. I've seen it anywhere from excuse me. I've seen estimates indicating that multi-factor authentication can stop anywhere from about 89% of attacks on up to in the mid-90s percentage-wise. Regardless of the actual number, it still has the potential to stop a huge number of attacks, so it's something that you should absolutely be using wherever you can, especially for administrative accounts or for any user accounts that are deemed to be particularly risky, high-level executives, IT members of the IT staff, things like that. But use it wherever you can. Priority number 4, harden your security admin workstations. This goes back to some of those stories that I was telling at the very beginning of the presentation about how every once in a while you'll see somebody that uses really egregious practices with regard to managing their domain controllers. Microsoft's recommendation for domain maintenance is to have dedicated workstations that serve that purpose and that purpose only. So that way, if an administrator needs to do any sort of Active Directory maintenance, they can sit down to one of these dedicated workstations, they can sign on using a dedicated administrative account, do what needs to be done, and then log off. You're not using that workstation to check email or to browse the internet or anything like that. It's used solely for the purpose of managing Active Directory. And the idea behind having a dedicated environment like that is that setting aside that dedicated environment makes it a whole lot less likely that any type of security incident will occur or that unauthorized software will begin to creep in on that machine. So one of Microsoft's real best practices is to not just deploy these types of dedicated admin workstations, but to make sure that you're only doing Active Directory administration from those workstations, not from anything else, and that you're not performing any non-related tasks from those workstations. So how do you go about setting up these workstations and making sure that they're secure? Well, the slide lists some of the various best practices from Microsoft, and I would go so far as to say that this isn't even a all-inclusive list. There may be other best practices that you should also be thinking about with regard to how you would set these up. And again, they're going to vary quite a bit from one organization to the next depending on your own needs. But let's take a look at a few of these. The first one on the list is perform a clean OS install, and then I added don't use the organization's gold images. Now, why is that? Well, if you've gone through the trouble of creating a gold image for your organization and it's configured to meet all of your specifications and all that, odds are the gold image is probably going to be okay. But if you've got an insider who's got bad intentions or something like that, they could tamper with that gold image just as a way of getting some sort of backdoor onto machines that are set up based on that gold image. So for me, if I'm really, really concerned about security and I want to make absolutely sure that this administrative workstation is going to be secure, I would feel a whole lot better just going ahead and using a known good, clean copy of Windows than using a gold image that's been altered over and over to match an organization's security best practices. So, maybe that means just going out onto the Microsoft website and downloading an ISO and then using that ISO to install Windows on that machine. Okay, so what's next on here? The next line, harden the operating system according to Microsoft's best practices. That's kind of a given. Then we have block internet access. Now, this is where things get a little bit tricky, because the idea that you should block this machine from having any sort of internet access, that suggestion came directly from Microsoft. But there are some who would be quick to point out, well, this machine needs internet access because it needs to be able to install updates, it needs to be able to get anti-malware updates, and that sort of thing. So yes, a case could be made for that. But if you look down toward the very bottom of the list, let's see, where's it at? The second to the last item on the list is install only software that is absolutely required. I would say that the software that is absolutely required would only include management tools that you need. I would actually go so far as to not install anti-malware software on this particular machine, even though it's really sensitive. And I know that there are probably plenty of people out there listening that are absolutely screaming at me right now, like, what, you're not going to install anti-malware software on there? But the thing is, you kind of get into a slippery slope, because the minute you install anti-malware software on there, that anti-malware software is only as good as it is current. There is a fundamental law of security that outdated anti-malware software is only marginally better than having none at all. And the only realistic way of keeping that anti-malware software up to date is to download updates off of the internet or to use some sort of removable media to update that. There are risks associated with either practice, because if you're installing off of the internet, that means that this machine now has to have internet access, which puts it at risk. If you're installing off of removable media, there's always the risk that that removable media could be carrying some sort of payload that you don't want to show up on that machine. So in my own mind, I would recommend just don't even include anti-malware software on the machine. Don't include anything that isn't absolutely 100% necessary in order for that machine to do its job. But, certainly you're free to disagree with me. Certainly you're free to set up the machine in whatever way makes sense for your own organization. But that would be my own personal recommendation for most situations. So what else do we have on the list? Another best practice is to configure servers to only accept requests from approved workstations. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can configure this. Certainly, you can't just completely cut your domain controllers off and make it so they only accept requests from management workstations. But what you can do is you can arrange your Active Directory environment so that you've got a top-level forest that's used only for management, and then you've got lower-tier forests that contain user and computer objects and that sort of thing. That's the way my own organization is set up. And then I've got management workstations that are members of that top-level forest. And then you can also use firewall rules to control the types of traffic that are allowed to be sent to and from the management machine and to and from other machines. So let's see what else. Yes, another best practice is require smart card access. And Microsoft recommends that you use two-factor authentication as a bare minimum. And, if there are extra factors of authentication that are required on those management machines, then that's only a good thing. And then Microsoft recommends that you disable USB ports, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, any sort of external connectivity that's not absolutely required in order for the machine to be able to function. And there are various ways of accomplishing this. There are group policy settings that you can use to disable these sorts of things. I've seen organizations go in and disable some of these features at the BIOS level. And then, excuse me, I've even seen way back when an organization that was particularly concerned about security, and I'm certainly not condoning this, just throwing it out there as a fun fact. I saw an organization that used to pump USB ports full of epoxy to keep them from being able to be used. Again, not condoning it, just something from history that makes for a fun fact. And then the very last item on the list, do not run the workstation as a virtual machine on your primary PC. The reason for that is because it's way too easy for something from the parent operating system, that's your normal copy of Windows that you use to check email and browse the internet and all that. It's way too easy for something from the parent operating system to make it into the virtual machine. Because let's face it, you can use the virtual machine clipboard to get information from the parent into the guest. You can shut down the guest and copy items directly into the virtual hard disk file. There are any number of ways to do that. So if you're really going to try to keep this management workstation as pristine and as secure as you possibly can, then I would strongly recommend not running that as a virtual machine, at least not on top of your primary workstation. It's best to use a dedicated physical machine if you possibly can, But if that's not an option, then run it as a virtual machine, but run it on a secure Hyper-V host or a secure VMware host or something like that, where there's very little risk of that management operating system becoming compromised. Priority number 5, enable smart lockouts. So lockouts are one of those things that have been a part of Windows ever since the early days with Windows NT back in, 1993 that NT came out? So it's been a part of Windows for decades, and it really hasn't changed very much. Lockouts are something I'm sure we're all familiar with, the idea being that a user enters their password incorrectly a few times and the account becomes locked, and then at that point the user either has to wait for it to automatically unlock or has to wait for an administrator to manually unlock the account. That's the way that it's worked since the 90s and maybe even before that in other platforms. And that exact same functionality still exists today even in Server 2022. Now, having said that, Azure AD contains a new type of lockout called Smart Lockouts. And it's worth taking a look at Azure AD to see if smart lockouts might be something that can really benefit your organization's security. Now, why might smart lockouts be important? Well, it really comes down to the idea that account lockouts have their good points and they have their bad points. The good point is that if an attacker is trying to get into a user's account and they're trying over and over, the account just locks out and the attack is completely shut down at that point. The attacker can't go any further, at least not with that account. That's the good point. The bad point is that there are unscrupulous actors out there who will use account lockout features as a denial of service tool. So how does this work? Well, and before I get into this, let me just qualify this by saying this is something that I've seen multiple times in the real world. Let's suppose for a moment that an attacker wants to initiate a denial of service attack against a particular organization. All they really need to know is the format of the user's login name. That's it. Once they know that, they can lock out any user account they want. So what the attacker would do is they go on LinkedIn or something like that, and they do a search for that particular organization. And what they're probably going to get is some search results that show employees who work for that company. And with any luck, those employees have listed their corporate email address within the search or within their LinkedIn profile. So by looking at that email address that's associated with that account, you can find out what naming convention the organization uses for all of its email addresses. Typically it's first name dot last name or first initial last name or something to that effect. So once the attacker knows what naming convention the organization uses for all of its email addresses, well, then it's open season. All they have to do is just start plugging in common names and then trying multiple password attempts for each one of those common names, and they start shutting down accounts, or locking out accounts, rather. And yes, that approach is a little bit random because at that point the attacker is just guessing about common names, but it doesn't have to be that random because the attacker can go out and do a little bit of research. They can find out the names of the members of the company's board of directors. Maybe they can find out the names of the people who work in the company's IT department, things like that. So then they can start targeting high-profile accounts and just log in, or attempt to log in, rather, as the account holder, intentionally enter a bad password multiple times, and then that account becomes locked out. And so then the owner of that account has to have the account unlocked. Typically there's a password change that goes along with it. And then as soon as that happens, the attacker comes along and locks it out all over again. So that's why lockouts in the traditional sense can be a bad thing. So what are these smart lockouts that Azure AD brings to the table? Well, the idea is that it's not always desirable to lock out an account, but there are certain times when an account lockout is important. So smart lockouts don't just take an all-or-nothing approach to account lockouts. They try to bring a little bit of intelligence to it. So, first of all, the smart account lockout feature doesn't penalize you for entering the same password multiple times. Let's suppose for a moment that I'm trying to log into my account and my password last week was, I don't know, password. And I've recently changed it, but I forgot about the change. So I type password as my password, and bam, sorry, your password's incorrect, try again. Well, I must have spelled it wrong, so I type the word password again, and I get another error. Well, in a situation like that, normally that counts as 2 bad attempts, and typically 1 more bad attempt, and I'm locked out. Well, the Smart Account Lockout feature is smart enough to know, okay, this is just a user who doesn't remember that they changed their password. They've typed the same password twice. They obviously know that this was their old password. Let's not penalize them for that. Let's count that as 1 bad attempt as opposed to however many times they entered the exact same password. So that makes it really nice for the end user. Another thing that this feature does is that it uses the concept of familiar location versus unfamiliar location. And it can differentiate between bad actors and genuine users by looking at their location. So if, for example, you've got a user who's sitting in your corporate office and struggling to log into their account, well, that's considered to be a benign action because the user is trying to log in from a known location. Whereas if you've got somebody in a rogue country on the other side of the world trying to log into the exact same account, well, that's probably a little bit more problematic. And so thankfully, Smart Lockout differentiates between the two. Another really cool thing that Microsoft does with the Smart Lockout feature is that they will actually deny a login, even if the user has the correct password, if various signals indicate that maybe this isn't a person who should be logging in. Now, Microsoft's a little bit tight-lipped about what constitutes this type of login. They don't tell you the exact criteria that has to be met, and that's probably a good thing because if they did disclose that, then the hackers could simply tailor their behavior to avoid those particular triggers. But the point being that there are conditions where even if an attacker has a valid set of credentials, they may not be able to log in. And and then the last thing on the list is that if the first sign-in after a lockout fails, then the account automatically locks out again. And then if the account gets locked out repeatedly, then the lockout duration will automatically increase so that way an attacker isn't going to be able to exploit smart lockouts as a way of making it easier to do a brute force attack. So what does the smart lockout mechanism look like? Well, here we are in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and I'm on the custom smart lockout screen. So you can see that you can set the lockout threshold and the lockout duration just like you can for normal lockouts. And then there are also a couple of mechanisms on here that don't really have a lot to do with smart lockouts, but they're worth taking a look at anyway, because you can set up a custom list of banned passwords. So if there are things that you don't want users to be able, or words you don't want users to be able to include in their password, you can include them on this list. Like maybe you don't want the user to have the company name as a part of their password or the current month as part of their password. You can add those words to the list. And then you can also choose whether you want to enable password protection on Windows Server Active Directory, and then you can set the mode to either audit or enforced. When you set the mode to audit, then your policies aren't actually being enforced. You just find out what would happen if the policies were enforced. And then once you verify that the policy is working properly through auditing the policy, then you can actually enable it by switching the mode to enforced. And so then the very last priority on the list, and this is actually something that falls a little bit more into the realm of something that your end users should be doing, but the priority is encourage your end users to review sign-ons. And I would also recommend doing this for admin accounts as well. But the idea being that Microsoft 365 environments will actually keep track of when you sign in and where you're signing in from. And it's a good idea to just go back periodically and review the list just to make sure that there aren't unexpected sign-ons on the list. So let's take a look at what this looks like. What a user would do is they would log into their Microsoft 365 environment, and then as we all know, in the upper right corner there's an icon that represents the user. You would click on that icon, and then from there you would click on View My Account, and then click on View Sign-ins. And you can see the View My Account screen in the lower right corner of the slide. And then there's an icon in the very lower right portion of the slide that says My Sign-ins. That's where you would click to go to the list of sign-ins. And when a user clicks on that, they're going to be taken to a screen like this. And it's going to show the location where the user has signed in from most recently, the operating system that was being used, the browser that was being used, the user's IP address. In this case, I've blanked that out, but normally that would be shown. The app that was being used during the sign-on, and which account was affected. And for the most recent sign-ins, you'll even get a map of the sign-in location. And then for other items further down the list, the map doesn't show up by default, but you can get it if you need it. One word of caution that I would give you about reviewing sign-ins, though, is that every once in a while you may get a totally unexpected result, even if a sign-on was legitimate. And this one actually happened to me a while back. I tend to travel a lot, but I hadn't been traveling. I had been at home, and I fully expected all of my sign-ins to show South Carolina, where I live. So I'm going through all of the sign-ons for the last few days, and then I see one that was listed as, I think it was Oakland, California. I was like, whoa, I have not been to California this week. You know, what's going on here? And it actually took me a little bit of time to dig through, but what I found out was that my cellular provider had actually been having some problems with their network that week, and a lot of my traffic was being relayed through California, and that's where that was coming from. And part of the way that I was able to decipher that was by looking at the operating system and some of the other information that was provided, and I realized that it was logins from my smartphone that were being sent through California, as opposed to an illegitimate login attempt from a bad guy. So that's just one more thing that I would recommend teaching your users to look for as a matter of security best practice. So with that, I am about out of time. I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Yeah, we got a few of them. Let's kick it off with a couple of questions relating to your talk about the separate desktop for AD. So if an organization is going to use a separate or unique desktop, that will always mean standalone updates. This could be problematic. How do you handle this concern?
There are a few different ways that you can handle it. One option is that you could put a dedicated update server on that segment of the network. And I've actually seen Microsoft make a recommendation similar to that. I wish I could remember the name of the publication where I saw this, but Microsoft provides a hardening guide for domain controllers, and one of the recommendations that they make is that when you're going to install security updates for domain controllers, don't get those updates from the same update server that supplies updates for everything else. Because if that update server were to become compromised, then you could end up running into issues with a bad update getting applied to your domain controllers, which is obviously a really bad thing. So their recommendation was to have a dedicated update server just for domain controllers. And if your management workstation is on a dedicated network and it's on that same network as your domain controllers, you could presumably use this dedicated update server. Another way that you could handle it is by doing out-of-band updates, but then you would have to have some form of removable media enabled in order to get those updates over to that. So it's just one of those things where there's not necessarily an easy answer, but it's one of those things that you'll definitely have to think about how you want to do it.
Okay, great. Anthony also had a question about the dedicated workstation. What are the recommendations for a completely remote workforce?
That's a really good question. I don't know that the recommendations necessarily changed that much, except that if you're completely 100% remote, then obviously it's going to be really tough to have a management workstation that is totally disconnected from the internet. One of the solutions that I've seen used in those types of situations is to use something called jump machines. The idea being that you start out with a machine in your home, you jump to another connection that's somewhere in your office, and then once you've remoted into that machine, then you remote from that machine to another machine, and then eventually into whatever it is that you're trying to manage. So you're not establishing a direct path from point A to point B, but rather you're passing through a number of different machines, each of which is increasingly secure. I don't know that that's necessarily a great solution, but it is something that is recommended in some of the Microsoft documentation.
Okay. Can I use third-party products for enhancing password security, or do I have to use the native Azure AD tools?
No, there are actually some really good third-party solutions out there. If you do go the third-party route, though, certainly you need to be thinking about how you're going to maintain those products in a secure manner.
Okay. Moving on. Normally, when a Microsoft product reaches its end-of-life date, the product will keep working. Won't that be the same case for Azure AD Connect?
Odds are when the current version of Azure AD Connect is retired, it will keep working for a while. I would expect to see it continue to work at least through the end of the year, maybe even a little bit longer. But I think because of the way that some of those underlying libraries are being decommissioned, I think we are going to hit the point at some point in time where it just suddenly stops working and shuts down for lack of supported libraries.
Okay. David wants to know, what are the best practices for backing up Azure Active Directory?
Best practices for backing up Azure Active Directory. One is that you absolutely should be backing it up. I would recommend backing up not just the SQL Server, but also the configuration in case you ever have to do a restoration. But having said that, I think the biggest best practice is that a restoration should be an absolute last resort. If you end up running into a problem with an Azure AD Connect server, or wait a minute, can you repeat the question? I think I'm answering the wrong question here.
Yeah, sure. It's what are the best practices for backing up AAD?
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry about that. For whatever reason, my mind went Azure AD Connect, and I started, talking about best practices for backing up an Azure AD Connect server. Okay, so best practices for backing up Azure AD Connect or Azure AD. To the best of my knowledge, the biggest best practice is to just make sure that you're using a backup vendor who fully supports that sort of thing. There are APIs that Microsoft provides to the backup vendors that will allow their products to natively back up Azure AD. So just make sure you're using a fully compatible backup solution that's designed for that rather than trying to make something that was designed solely for on-premises environments work with Azure AD. And then just like an on-premise environment, you don't want to be doing any type of authoritative Active Directory restoration unless you absolutely have no other choice, because you can cause all kinds of consistency problems with your Active Directory objects if you were to revert them to an earlier point in time.
Okay, and thanks for the bonus info on the AD Connect. Looks like we have time for just one more question. Does smart lockouts work if you have a hybrid environment, i.e. AD Sync?
I'm not really sure. I'm inclined to think that they would probably only work with the Azure AD side of things. I don't think that they work for the on-premises side, but I'm not 100% sure on that either.
Okay, well, looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Thanks so much, Brian.
Yeah, thank you for having me.